Hello. My presentation will be on the nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands. It's a basic report of the testing period that occurred during the period of the trusteeship when the United States was a strategic trust administrator for the Marshall Islands. Just to give you some background, I just wanted to show you where the Marshall Islands is and where Micronesia is. The Marshall Islands is actually an independent nation with a special agreement with the United States called the Compact of Free Association. Here is the location of the Marshall Islands. Right here, it's in Micronesia, and apparently recent genetic studies are showcasing that they are part of the Austronesian Lapita group that originated from Southeast Asia, specifically Taiwan. Just to give you a map of the Marshall Islands, it is composed of two chains. The western chain is called the Relic chain, and the eastern chain is called the Relic chain. The Marshall Islands is composed of 29 atolls and 5 islands. Atolls are sunken volcanoes, in case you don't know that. So why am I discussing the Marshall Islands today as it relates to the theme of the conference today? Well, it's because there was a history of nuclear testing there that occurred in 1946 to 1958. The testing in the Marshall Islands began in 1946, shortly after the first Trinity testing in New Mexico in 1945, and ended in 1958. Two testing sites were Bikini Atoll and ENEWETAK Atoll. There were 24 atmospheric detonations in Bikini and 43 in ENEWETAK Atoll. Of course, let's not forget that there were also 2 combat bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Bikini testing started at 1946, in which 167 Bikini and indigenous people were relocated. History of the nuclear testing. The final test in ENEWETAK was in 1958, but perhaps the most famous one that people are more attuned to is Castle Bravo shot, which was conducted in Bikini on March 1st, 1954, which is approximately 1,000 times stronger than the one conducted in Hiroshima. The explosive power of the nuclear test in the Marshall Islands equaled 108 megatons, accounting for 80% of the yield of all atmospheric tests exploded by the US. To put this level of testing at Bikini and ENEWETAK in perspective, this is the same as 1.6 Hiroshima bombs being detonated every day for the 12 years of testing. Now, just to give you guys a visual of where the testing sites are, here's ENEWETAK and there's Bikini. And right over here, these are the downwinder sites in which the 1954 Bravo shot affected. And right here, as I'm pointing at Ailok, this was an atoll that received just as much fallout as Udarak Atoll, but unfortunately, the US government does not acknowledge the Ailok community. Only Udarak, Krongalap, Bikini, and ENEWETAK got some form of compensation, not full compensation, but at least some form of compensation. The Ailok people were not evacuated, unlike these other people, apparently because there were 400 people and the US government deemed it inconvenient to evacuate 400 people at that time. This is just a visual of the CACTUS dome on RUNIT Island. You guys can see that this huge bomb crater happened because of those 67 tests. And here, this is what they call the RUNIT dome. Some natives like to call it the tomb. This is where a lot of the nuclear waste, the rubble that were brought in and were buried into this dome and sealed under concrete. However, it has been known that studies are indicating that 80 to 90% of the nuclear waste actually exists outside this dome. In other words, outside of this dome is more radiated than what's inside it. Just to give you guys additional visuals, this is a before and after shot of ENEWETAK. You see here, clearly there was land there. And now you look at the after shot and there is none there. This is just a picture of one of the tests called a Baker test. And you guys can see that, the United States wanted to test these atomic detonations on a naval fleet. So they lined up all these ships and tested them just so that they could see what the effects of the bombs would be in a wartime situation against the naval fleets, just in case the US was cornered and had to resort to nuclear testing. The impacts of the nuclear testing period. There was intangible losses such as cultural loss of sustainable livelihood as people were moved. They lost their sense of culture and their land and their sense of connection to the land. They are now under a welfare state and largely dependent on foreign aid. And there is a sense of mental colonization where they believe that they have to depend on the US. Obviously, there is still loss of land and resources due to lack of legal and legitimate recognition and acknowledgement of actual value of the loss of the land and resources through fair compensation, and that's still an issue till today. The tangibles obviously would be cancers like diseases, starvation, malnourishment, deteriorating health of people exposed, intergenerational effects where people are now predisposed to cancer, and of course, lack of access to healthcare and medical resources. There's also the issue of population displacement. Up till today, 90% of Bikinians have never seen bikini. The health impacts here were the immediate effects of the Bravo shot that I said earlier. Here's a woman called Nerje Joseph. She was a young girl right here. When she was 8 years old, she saw the fallout. She thought it was snow. She played with it, and her hair started to fall off. She thought it was some form of liquid powder detergent and soap, so she put it in her hair and used it as shampoo, only to find her hair falling. Here are some radiation burns, just to give you guys some visuals of the Bravo victims of Rangalap Atoll and Wuduruk. Some of the common health impacts were like obviously their skin burning and peeling and thyroid cancer. As you can see, this woman is being inspected, and the most extremes of the health impacts would be death. Here are some health impacts. This was by the National Cancer Institute, since these are some of the predicted radiation-related cancers that have already taken place, including leukemia, thyroid, stomach, and colon cancers, amongst others. Now, this is not to say that Marshallese were completely complacent. Actually, for many years, Marshallese were active in petitioning the world community to end the nuclear weapons testing program. The original request came from Dorothy Tarikabua and her son Amata, who represented Micronesia at the UN Trusteeship Council meetings in July of 1953, the year before Bravo happened, which caused like a lot of the catastrophic images you just saw. There were 2 UN resolutions in response to petitions in 1954 when the Bravo happened, and in 1956, trusteeship resolutions 1082 and 1493, in which the US explicitly authorized specific use of the nuclear weapons, and our people have carried a burden which no other people should ever have to bear. Obviously, as you guys know, the nuclear testing period did not end in 1956. It ended 2 years later in 1958, despite these petitions and formal petitions, and despite earlier attempts to end the nuclear testing program in 1953. There is a special, the US does not acknowledge the nuclear ban treaty, but it does acknowledge the NPT conference outcome. NP, non-nuclear proliferation treaty, which states that the conference in one of their outcome documentations in 1995, it acknowledges that there's still a special responsibility owed to these people of the Marshall Islands that function as a nuclear testing ground, basically ground zero during the United Nations trusteeship period. And just to give you guys some other background information, there was also a petition from Representative Amata Kabua concerning the Pacific Islands. It reported that Americans conducted blood tests of the inhabitants of the region, taken together with other reports to the Trusteeship Council and Security Council regarding the status of the healthcare system in the trust territories of the Pacific Islands. The US clearly understood that the nuclear test had a negative impact on the physical well-being of the inhabitants. Regardless, the test continued into the late 1950s, as I stated earlier. There was also moral corruption within the ranks, hence why the testing continued. Here are some of the quotes that kind of speak to this effect. There are only 90,000 people out there. Who gives a damn? That's Henry Kissinger. We don't consult the United Nations, we inform. Why, it may be asked, should the homes of these people so far removed from the international politics in the Cold War become the site for such experiments? The answer is that the Marshall Islands were selected only after the most careful examination of every possible alternative site. The US government found that there is no other place in the world over which the United States has jurisdiction where the experiments of this nature could be successfully conducted. You guys can take the time to read a lot of these statements. They're kind of heartbreaking, and it just goes to show that, power is a real currency, and the US did not care. Even though under the trusteeship agreement, it was supposed to ensure the well-being of the inhabitants, including safeguarding their natural resources and their health, as well as helping them with their economic self-sufficiency. And the nuclear testing period up to this day proved to be the opposite of what they were administered to do under the trusteeship agreement, which was signed in 1947 even though the testing began in 1946. Just to give you guys a statement from the Brookhaven National Laboratory, when some of the people of Ronlap were relocated to the atolls that were bombed, which was extremely stupid in many of our experts' testimonies, even though the radioactive contamination of Ronlap Island was considered perfectly safe for human habitations, this is what they said: the levels of activity are higher than those found in other inhabited locations in the world. The habitation of these people on the islands will afford most valuable ecological radiation data on human beings. So obviously, putting the people there provided some form of data so that they could see the effects of long-term radiation exposure through the subsistence lifestyle that most Marshallese were already practicing during this time. It's a bit inhumane, but power is a real currency, like I said before, and that's where this cause for nuclear justice is something that the Marshall Islands is still pushing forward. Just to give you guys some perspective into the nuclear weapons yields in RMI as compared to the ones in Nevada in World War II. 108 megatons literally dwarfs the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs that were dropped in World War II in Japan and the ones that were dropped in Nevada. The total yield of the 67 tests conducted in the Marshall Islands was 108 megatons. This equates to the explosive force of over 100 million tons of TNT and more than 75 times the total yield of the US nuclear tests in Nevada. 6.3 billion curies were released to the Marshall Islands, as opposed to the Nevada sites and Chernobyl, Hanford. Again, it literally dwarfs that. It's as if Marshallese people are not human. They're animals and lab rats, according to most of the victims. This recently declassified 1955 Atomic Energy Commission report reported that other than the 4 atolls that the US were formally acknowledging as having been affected, these other atolls in the Marshall Islands have significant amounts of radiation doses that exceed the internationally recognized standards deemed safe. And even if you look at the political settlement and the compensation of how much people got, 24,000 Americans got over $1 billion, whereas only 72.9 million were afforded to 60,000 Marshallese. And if you guys want to read that, during Bravo, the people of Ronlap that were directly exposed, there were 82 of them. They asked for 8.5 million because they found out that the 23 Japanese fishermen from the Lucky Dragon got 2 million, each got $100 a piece. So they thought, as wards of the United Nations, they deserve no less. Unfortunately, the Chief Justice of the Trust Territory, an American official, said that they had no adjudicatory jurisdiction on the ground that the US was immune from the lawsuit unless it gave it consent, which it hadn't, or unless Congress passed a bill permitting such litigation. They received money 10 years later in its 1964 session, and it only authorized a payment to them of only $950,000. If you look at the environmental cleanup, it is really obvious where that disparity in how Marshallese humans are treated versus American humans. Right over here, you can see how much billions and billions of dollars were afforded to the cleanup cost, even though as I move forward, you guys see the wider geographical area in the Marshall Islands. Bikini and ENEWETAK were only given 0.25 billion, 0.25 billion, 0.09 billion respectively, as compared to 50.3 billion for Hanford Reservation alone. And you guys can just look at the chart and just see that evidence of inhumane treatment. Here is the affected area compensation. Marshall Islands is geographically all water. Doesn't necessarily mean that the water doesn't carry radiation. Now, here is another angle to the story. Like, which stories get told? Who has visibility? Everyone knows about the Japanese internment camp, but does anybody know about the Marshallese internment camp, specifically Project 4.1, in which Marshallese were actually taken and treated as lab rats, being tested for nuclear, being tested for the nuclear effects. And some of these people were actually control groups in which these weren't directly affected people, but they were brought in to be compared and forcibly injected with nuclear radioactive substances so that they could compare what the difference was between a directly affected Bravo victim versus someone who was just injected with the same radiation dose. Some of the experiments included drinking radioactive substances so that they could see the difference between what it was with like drinking radiation versus being injected with it versus being showered with it by being at the actual site. So whose body, whose name? Obviously, you guys know the bikini swimsuit, but you guys don't know that bikini is actually the indigenous name of an atoll, a sacred name. And if you go to Bikini today, I can swear to you that most Bikinians will swear by it that they don't wear bikinis. In fact, bikini is wearing a bikini for most Bikinians is offensive. It's culturally offensive. They're a very conservative society and their dress code is very modest. This is what a more appropriate bikini woman would be wearing. Everyone knows the story of SpongeBob. It has become like a comedy where radiation is funny to most Americans, and that's the bikini bottom world. But in reality, the bikini bottom world is radiated, it's isolated, it is abandoned because of these nuclear testing period, something that is being made fun of. Here we have Godzilla, again, something that is born out of nuclear radiation in Bikini in 1954. It becomes a source of entertainment for Japanese. Here are some of the more recent photos. I wouldn't say recent, but it nevertheless showcases some of the effects of nuclear radiation. Like this child right here with this huge tumor is actually a third generation nuclear victim, showcasing the intergenerational effects. Now you have these stories. Sadako Sasaki, everyone knows her. She was the one that actually folded the 1,000 paper cranes and made the wish to cure her cancer. And you have Sadako Mas, a Marshallese woman from Ailok, one of the atolls in which is not recognized by the United States, who had died of leukemia. So I guess the question is, whose stories get told, who is not? Here we have a child whose stories is left out, who's suffering from mental illnesses from the nuclear testing program. Yet their stories aren't spoken, only amongst their own community, but not globally, even though this is a legacy of nuclear proportions that actually has to be told globally so that these people can get some sort of human dignified relief. So I guess my personal message is that the right of equal dignity is a human right. It is etched ever so clearly in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights produced by the United Nations. It is crucial that Marshallese are equally dignified as human beings. You know, the Compact of Free Association between the Marshall Islands, it actually bases its relationship on the respect for human rights, but the reality of it is to the contrary. We still need victim assistance and environmental remediation, and this has been a statement stated repeatedly in United Nations conversations where the human rights discourses take place. There is an important responsibility for user states, those that have tested, to provide adequate assistance and environmental remediation. Just going back to the 1995 Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty Conference documentation, it clearly stated that there is still this special responsibility towards these people of the former UN trust territories. And I only bring up the NPT documentation because the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty is the only treaty that the US actually officially recognized, because it does not recognize the recent nuclear ban treaty. There can literally be no closure without full disclosure, and Marshall Islands has already submitted these new evidence that have come to light as the science has become more and more clear through a changed circumstances to no avail. I just wanted to give this presentation and to reaffirm the special responsibility toward the Marshall Islands. During the period of the trusteeship, they were a United Nations trust territory administered by the United States, in which the United States conducted many nuclear tests on the islands. The legacy of this testing and U.S. colonial control has made the Marshall Islands more vulnerable to climate change and makes the United States responsibility for safe resettlement of displaced human population and the restoration to economic productivity of their affected areas that more crucial to consider. That's all, and if you guys have any questions, if I can answer them, please shoot me an email. It's ddoulatram@cmi.edu. And on behalf of Reach Me, this nonprofit organization I co-founded, I just wanted to say KOMMOL TATA.